Fire Emblem is one of my favorite game series that, like many, I first discovered through Super Smash Bros. Melee's inclusion of the characters Marth and Roy. It didn't take much to impress me back then. All you had to do was be a character with a sword and I was hooked. I found myself reading the trophy descriptions for Marth and Roy over and over again, sparking a desire to know more and more about them. And then one day at my local GameStop, I saw Fire Emblem Sacred Stones, the 8th installment in the franchise, and my introduction to the series. From there I bought every game that would release and watched the series grow from struggling niche franchise to mainstream status. Hello everybody and welcome to Silver Rooster, where today we will be discussing the history of Fire Emblem, starting with what I like to refer to as the Kaga era. It was April 20th, 1990 when Japan would first be introduced to Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light. However, the story of the game's development goes nearly 20 years earlier to the 1970s, when Nintendo decided to expand into the world of electronics. One of the first steps was to split the newly founded electronics department into 3 branches for research and development. These branches would be dubbed R&D1, R&D2, and R&D3. Real creative with the names here. R&D1 is the team we'll be focusing on for this topic. Among this team are some names Nintendo fans should recognize, like Shigeru Miyamoto, the gaming visionary responsible for the creation of Mario and Legend of Zelda, working under Gunpei Yokoi, the eventual creator of the Nintendo Game Boy. After Miyamoto left R&D1 following the success of Donkey Kong, a group of R&D1 programmers formed their own company, Intelligent Systems, which was then almost bought immediately by Nintendo. This new group continued under the tutelage of Yokoi, and would strive to create a game that was different from anything Nintendo had released thus far. This desire would lead to the creation of Famicom Wars, releasing in 1988, and would be the first in a long line of strategy games for the company. Taking control of one of 2 warring nations, Red Star and Blue Moon, players would be tasked with leading their selected nation to victory. After Famicom Wars' success, Intelligent Systems aimed at creating something new once again, a game that would combine the strategy elements of Famicom Wars with the deep storytelling and memorable characters players would find in an RPG. But who would be up to the task of crafting such a game? Shouzou Kaga would be the man to answer that question. See, this is why I refer to it as the Kaga era. Kaga would quickly put the studio to work at crafting his vision, ditching the modern military setting Famicom Wars was known for, in favor of a medieval fantasy setting. 2 years of hard work later, and Japan would be gifted the aforementioned Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light. With the first Fire Emblem game officially released, players would join the plight of Marth, a prince exiled from his home, his sister Elise taken hostage, and his father killed by the evil priest Garneth. Marth would begin his journey building an army, finding the legendary sword Falchion and the mysterious Fire Emblem in order to fight back against the nations that had sided with Garneth and slay the resurrected Shadow Dragon Medeus. For its time, it was a remarkable story, as games with stories were harder to come by. Gameplay-wise, Fire Emblem held close to its roots in quite a few ways. Similar to Famicom Wars, battles were automatically decided by offensive and defensive numbers alone. Although battles did take place with individual units rather than groups of troops, it also differed in how players would view their units. Rather than building troops and sending them to their deaths like in Famicom Wars, Kaga sought for players to become emotionally invested in each of their units. Each unit was unique, had their own story, and different roles to play within your army. You had archers that could attack from a distance, units in heavy armor to hold the front lines, and so many more. Almost all of these units could be promoted to more powerful classes, and each of them leveled up with standard RPG mechanics. One last feature that would invest players in their character is an infamous mechanic that would be a staple in Fire Emblem for many years: permanent death, or permadeath, as fans have come to call it. Permadeath meant that when one of your characters fell in battle, they were dead for good, with no way of returning them to your army. This mechanic, of course, altered the game tremendously, as the story would change based on certain characters' survival. Each chapter became a dance with death as you tried to keep your favorite units alive. This, along with enemy units who were ruthless in their tactics and inability to save in the middle of a chapter, made Fire Emblem one of the hardest games of its era, and a big challenge for gamers. At its release, the game didn't review very well, and it wasn't the most technologically advanced game at the time. time, it received criticism stating its graphics were unimpressive and the hybrid of strategy game with RPG mechanics was too complicated. Sales were initially low at release, but positive word of mouth made the game enough of a success that Nintendo wanted a sequel to be made. 2 years after their success, Intelligent Systems would release Fire Emblem Gaiden, which translates to Fire Emblem Side Story. This story takes place on the continent of Valentia, a land to the west of Arcanea, where we witnessed Marth's story. Valentia was split in two by feuding sibling gods, and follows two main characters, Alm and Celica, who each would lead separate armies in an attempt to reunite the land. Intelligent Systems would attempt to tackle the criticism of the previous entry by adding in more RPG elements, such as an overworld and towns to explore. But reviewers criticized how different the game was from its predecessor, complaining that Gaiden's strategy elements were notably weaker in comparison. Intelligent Systems really just can't get a win no matter which genre they choose to lean into. Gaiden would prove to be an even more difficult game than Shadow Dragon as well. Despite this, it managed to outsell its predecessor, which naturally meant the series would be continued to Nintendo's newer console, the Super Famicom, or Super Nintendo as we knew it in the States. Seeing as the Super Famicom released in November of 1990, it's even more impressive that Shadow Dragon and Gaiden were a hit being released on an older console in 1990 and 92, but now Intelligent Systems was ready to try their hand on a Super Famicom game. So they decided Fire Emblem's third entry would serve as both a remake and a sequel to Shadow Dragon. Since many people possibly would have missed the first entry due to it releasing on an older console the same year Nintendo released a new one, this decision resulted in Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. The game was split into two parts, referred to as Book 1 and Book 2. Book 1 being a remake of Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, and Book 2 serving as the sequel. Although the Super Famicom was a powerful console at the time, it didn't have the power to hold what was basically two games in one package. Some cuts had to be made in Book 1. 5 chapters and 6 whole characters were removed in order for Book 2 to also fit on the cartridge. But Mystery overall was far from lacking content. It took many of the ideas that worked in Gaiden and expanded upon them, as well as having improved graphics from their 8-bit counterparts, allowing your units' look to further differentiate from each other. Simple but effective changes added included colored tiles to help understand where your units can move. Each weapon was made to look different from others, adding more personality to the story, and the early stages of series staple, the support system, would be added, making it so your units would perform even better in battle when fighting near their family or friends. These and many other mechanics would only continue to improve as the series went on. Mystery of the Emblem proved to be a great success, selling over 750,000 copies. This success led the series into some side projects as well, such as manga that once again retold the stories of the games, but with some added content. And of course, when there's manga, anime follows. Created in 1996 were 2 pilot episodes that retold the story of Shadow Dragon once again. Strangely enough, these 2 pilot episodes, long before international releases of the series was even considered, would make their way over to America, becoming the true first exposure of the series to an untapped market outside of Japan. Even stranger than this was the release of another bizarre side project called BS Fire Emblem, or Fire Emblem Arcanea Saga, releasing in 1997 for the Satellaview, a Japan-exclusive device add-on for the Super Famicom. This strange device allowed the Super Famicom to receive satellite signals from the Wow Wow station in Tokyo, and with a monthly fee, you would be able to download new games right to your console. BS Fire Emblem used this to give players 4 new maps to choose from, taking place in between Mystery's Book 1 and Book 2. And let me tell you, these maps absolutely were BS. But hey, at least Fire Emblem fans were being exposed to more content than they could ask for. With the next entry, Kaga wanted to do something new, wanting to produce a historical epic where the world undergoes great change over periods of time, and wanting to show both the heroes and villains as fighting for their own justice. This would lead to the creation of Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War, set in the continent of Jugdral, a land split into 8 countries founded by the 12 Crusaders. The game is split into 2 story arcs, each separated by the time span of a generation. The first generation sees players taking control of Lord Sigurd as he defends the duchies of Granville from a sudden invasion from the neighboring kingdom of Verdane. However, a conspiracy framing Sigurd and his father Bylin for the murder of Granville's Prince Kurth would set in motion a series of events leading to the creation of the tyrannical Granville Empire, all while a cult responsible for the conspiracy plots the creation of a vessel to resurrect their Dark Lord Lopter. The second generation would then take place 17 years later, where players would join Sigurd's son Selith, who would fight against the Granville Empire and the cult of Lopter to restore order to Jugdral. This generational split would even be masterfully integrated into the gameplay, with most of the units available in Sigurd's army being able to marry and have children, who would go on to be the units players use in Selith's army. If for any reason parents weren't married by the end of Sigurd's story, substitutes would take place of the offspring instead. Alongside this, the combat system would also be improved. It would be the first Fire Emblem game to incorporate skills, which were special abilities that could change the outcome of a battle. These skills could even be passed down to the children of the second generation, adding further customability for players based on what units they chose to pair in the first generation. This would also be the first game to include Fire Emblem's iconic weapon triangle, a system that completely changed how you played. A rock-paper-scissors mechanic made up of 2 triangles, one for physical attacks and one for magical attacks. Swords beat axes, axes beat lances, and lances beat swords. Pairing the right weapon with the right opponent became integral to how players approached combat, otherwise you'd risk losing your unit. Genealogy's incredible story and innovative game mechanics made it the greatest Fire Emblem to date, and many to this day still consider it the best in the series. Despite this, the game has never seen an official release outside of Japan. The next game in the series would be 1999's Fire Emblem Thracia 776. I don't know what the numbers mean, which took a page out of Gaiden's book and opted to tell a side story featuring Leaf, one of the many possible children from Genealogy, taking place in between chapters 5 and 6. Thracia wouldn't have the easiest start. Not only was this Super Famicom game released 3 years after Nintendo's more powerful N64, it was released by a Japan-only Nintendo Power service where users would download Super Famicom and Game Boy games onto flash cartridges at special kiosks in stores. A physical release would only see the light of day 1 year later in 2000, still on the older, less powerful Super Famicom console. This more than likely played a major role in this becoming one of the worst selling titles in the series. Thracia would further innovate the gameplay from Genealogy with the introduction of gameplay mechanics such as Rescue, which allowed stronger units to rescue others from harm at the cost of some penalties to their stats. Exclusive to Thracia and another future Fire Emblem title, Capture was a more offensive version of Rescue, in which units would seize enemies rather than killing them. Players could then take weapons from the captured enemy, let them go, or hold on to them in an attempt of recruiting them. Fog of War was added to certain maps, adding an additional tactical challenge to the game, and a fatigue system was added where units who overexerted themselves in a previous battle wouldn't be available for the next. Another added mechanic were Gaiden chapters, side stories unlocked when fulfilling certain conditions, and escape chapters where players were forced to flee rather than fight. Thracia became known as the most difficult Fire Emblem game ever created. The game would show no mercy whatsoever. Enemies and their tactics were brutal, and players had to be more careful than ever before to keep their units alive. The game also flat out didn't tell players how to play, as this game was meant for veteran players. Its difficulty was likely also to blame for its poor sales. Thracia would also be the last game in the Kaga era, as Shouzou Kaga, who had a heavy hand in guiding the series from the very beginning, actually departed Intelligent Systems only a few weeks before the game released. From this point forward, Fire Emblem would no longer be spearheaded by Kaga. Before we can talk about the next era of Fire Emblem, I feel it's important to talk more about Kaga's departure, as it directly affects the next era. However, the story of Kaga's departure from Intelligent Systems is a long one that would need an entire dedicated video to cover, but I'll try to give a shortened version for now. After leaving Intelligent Systems, Kaga went on to create his own development studio called Tirnanog. This studio would then begin development on a new title, Emblem Saga, later changed to Tearing Saga. Tearing Saga would release on the PlayStation on May 24th, 2001, and a year later, on November 14th, 2002, Nintendo would sue Tir for copyright infringement and unfair competition law. They cited Kaga's game was purposely confusing fans and leading them to think it was a new entry to the Fire Emblem series releasing on PlayStation, damaging the Fire Emblem brand, and asked Tir to halt sales and provide a hefty monetary compensation. In this lawsuit, Nintendo's lawyers focused on every single similarity the game shared with Fire Emblem. Nintendo essentially argued Kaga had copied Fire Emblem in every way simply because they looked the same. Fire Emblem, the series Kaga produced and directed, looked too similar to his new creative work. So to the shock of no one, Nintendo lost this case as Kaga's defense team stated regardless if he was a former Fire Emblem developer, all the similarities between both games were not truly exclusive to Fire Emblem, nor the strategy RPG genre as a whole. It was actually this case's ruling that set the precedent that game series could have clones or spiritual successors as long as they were legally distinct. This victory would be short-lived, however, as in November 24th, 2004, Nintendo sued Tir for copyright infringement and unfair competition. Yeah, they're attempting the exact same lawsuit, asking the court to undo the results of the first lawsuit. Now, most of you are probably thinking, this would simply result in the same ruling, but not this time, for this time Nintendo had receipts. Remember when I said Tearing Saga used to be called Emblem Saga? Well, despite that name change, the game was still advertised in Japan as Emblem Saga. Kaga's defense would again argue that any similarities between the two games was purely coincidental, and a result of both having the same creative mind. While similitudes were again brushed off, Kaga's team failed to explain why he had to advertise the game with Emblem in the title, even after the title was changed. This wasn't even the most damning evidence Nintendo brought to the court. Nearly every instance leading up to the release of Tearing Saga, where Kaga either directly or indirectly referenced the continuity of Fire Emblem, was presented. Many examples come from various Famitsu interviews, where in one of them, Kaga was blatantly asked, "Will characters from previous games make a return?" To which Kaga answered, "A certain shape-shifting youth will have an important role in the guise of a mysterious bard and sage." You may have picked up on it, but Kaga is referring to Zane here, a character introduced in the very first Fire Emblem. But that's not the end of it. That's only the first half of his answer. Let's continue. Since this game occurs in the same time period as the first game, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, more characters may return if the need arises. There is really no way any Fire Emblem fan would see this interview and not assume that Tearing Saga was going to be a continuation of Fire Emblem, which obviously it wasn't. Believe it or not, things got worse as Nintendo's lawyers continued to provide even more evidence that I just don't have the time to go over in this video, but it truly does seem that Kaga really did try to lead fans into thinking that Fire Emblem was being moved to the PlayStation by heavily promoting Tearing Saga in a way that associated it with the Fire Emblem universe, which under Japanese law is considered unfair competition. Nintendo's final attack would show that Tearing Saga used development materials from both Thracia 776 and a unfinished Fire Emblem entry, presumably the cancelled Fire Emblem 64, using development materials he didn't legally own. It became evident that Kaga always had plans for unfair competition, at best due to negligence, and at worst intent. So this second trial again failed to prove Kaga was violating copyright laws. It did show that he was guilty of unfair competition, causing a heavy sum to be paid to Nintendo in damages. This really is a strange rabbit hole that I haven't even covered all the details of, but as you can expect, any hopes Kaga may have had about continuing to shape the world he created in Fire Emblem was completely shattered, as it was no longer his. He left it behind when he left Intelligent Systems. So where did all of this leave Fire Emblem? Well, with Kaga gone, someone had to step up and help guide the next game, and thankfully, someone would. But we'll talk more about that in what I like to call the GBA era. With that, all I have left to say is, love you, mean it, click. Hey guys, if you're still here, go ahead and hit like and subscribe for me. If I managed to keep your attention this long, I'd say I've earned it. I get at least one of these video essays out each month and have a video on collectathons in the works. I'd like to try to get that one released in January. I'd also like to try and release the history of Fire Emblem's GBA era in January as well. So I'm going to try to get both done for it. I'll keep you guys updated on my progress if the GBA era needs to be pushed back into being a February upload. And lastly, before you go, have yourself a very Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.